Thank you, Christoph. I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to follow up on this. I think you know everything about me now. I don't have any secrets anymore, but I'll try. So, well, thank you, Christoph, for this, but also for everything else. Thank you to the RCC, first of all, for having me for so long already, and I'll be here for, two more months, which is also the deadline of my submission. So you will not see so much of me in the next couple of weeks. I apologize for that, but you can always reach out via email. Just wanted to preface my talk like that. And thank you for the 3 cohorts of Landhaus Fellows that I've stayed with already. This was truly a unique experience, I have to say. I learned so much from everybody who was at the house. And yeah, I can just say thank you to everyone who was here and everyone who I'll be sharing the house with in the future. See you all here. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to that. With all of that being said, there are basically 2 things that I want to do today. I want to give you an overview of the PhD that I've been working on for the last years. However, because that PhD is divided into 4 very different case studies, I'm not going to go into every single chapter in detail because I think that would be just too much. However, if you have questions about any of the other case studies I'm not discussing in detail, feel free to come up after in the Q&A or, as I said, via email if you see me around. So the first part of the presentation is going to be that overview. And then the second part is basically one of my chapters on the desert and the goats. I have more in this PhD than the desert and sand and goats. And I brought a primary source from the archives that I thought would be interesting to look at together, and I'll build my presentation around that. So without further ado, in my research, and it's entitled Landscape and Power in Mandate Palestine, 1917 to 1948, I examine 4 different landscape changes to show how environmental practices influence power relations by enabling new forms of access and control over land, sovereignty, and rights. In doing so, I am mostly interested in the dynamics between the 2 colonial projects, the British Mandate and the Zionist movement, and how their actions changed the landscape and the lives of the people in Palestine. Before getting into more detail, I want to make a quick detour and explain the time and place that we are finding ourselves in. So the British Mandate for Palestine was established by the League of Nations at the end of World War I. And Palestine had been part of the Ottoman Empire, which, as a loser of the war, had dissolved at its end. The mandate system was created in order for the so-called more advanced countries, such as Britain and France, to give, quote, administrative advice and assistance until such time as the inhabitants of the mandate countries are able to stand alone. This was from the League of Nations Covenant. In this capacity, the British ruled over Palestine from 1917 until 1948. And the British had to govern over 2 main populations, the local Arab Palestinians and the Jewish immigrants from Europe. At the outset of the mandate, the British had made conflicting promises to these 2 groups. They had promised to enable the creation of the Jewish national home in Palestine to the Jews and the Zionist movement, and at the same time they had committed to, quote, safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. And this is also what has become known today as the dual obligation of the British in Palestine. The 30 years of British rule in Palestine were characterized by increasing Jewish immigration and Zionist efforts at building a Jewish state. With it came increased pressures on resources and land, and increasing tensions between the groups as Arab Palestinians resisted their colonization and marginalization, and Zionists increasingly resisted British rule. The day after the British left Palestine in 1948, the State of Israel was established, and 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of the country in the ensuing war between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, which today is called the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this very briefly is the broader context in which my research is located. My research shows that man-made landscape changes are crucial for understanding human relationships in colonial and imperial spaces, including in nascent conflict zones such as Palestine-Israel. Landscape changes in mandatory Palestine influenced both Zionist Arab and Zionist British relationships, by manifesting and transferring power and revealing underlying cultural convictions and political goals. Both Zionist ideology and the British imperial worldview became imprinted onto the Palestinian environment through, for example, afforestation and soil erosion policies. I show this based on 4 different case studies, each of which highlights unique but comprehensive dynamics. Firstly, land reclamation techniques, forestry, the Dead Sea development, and botanical gardens. Case studies 1 and 2 focus on British perceptions and policies, while case studies 3 and 4 focus on Jewish and Zionist agency. And the main idea of the research is to bring different types of landscape changes together, to better understand how they work together, how they enable and reinforce each other, and what their underlying ideologies and rationalizations are. And ultimately, what types of dynamics we have to pay attention to in order to understand colonial power relations connected to the environment. The first chapter on land reclamation techniques shows that British views of the Palestinian environment can be summarized as environmental orientalism, which is a term mostly developed by Diana Davis. These views express themselves as assumptions about the allegedly degraded state of the land and fears of further degradation through soil erosion, overgrazing, and so-called neglectful land ownership. British policies aimed at restoring the Palestinian landscape to an imagined former and more fertile state. These policies directly affected local life, for example, when the British singled out the Palestinian goat as the country's most destructive animal, and as a result, targeted nomadic Arab pastoralists and their flocks through sedentarization policies. The chapter contributes to the literature on colonial sedentarization policies of local nomadic peoples by focusing on these policies' environmental motivations. It also uncovers the cultural convictions underlying landscape changes, introduced by a colonial power that had little understanding of arid environments. And the primary source that I brought for today is going deeper into this chapter. Chapter 2 on forestry shows how selective afforestation played an important role in mandatory Palestine, altering the landscape significantly. The chapter studies how Zionist afforestation practices made Jewish claims to land possible, helped to demarcate future Israeli state borders, and helped Jewish immigrants from Europe to adjust to their new environment. Colonial British forestry practices and their underlying rationalization revealed British perceptions of progress and modernization and their application in Palestine. Moreover, British colonial forestry officers were part of a global network of so-called experts traveling throughout the empire, thereby contributing to the far-reaching spread of a specific canon of environmental knowledge. By focusing on trees, this chapter shows how plants can carry cultural and symbolic meaning, and how they can be used to make political claims or support an ideology. It also shows how a settlement project does not consist of its human agents only, and in which ways non-human settlers can be impactful as well. The third chapter is on the industrial development of the Dead Sea mineral resources. In 1930, the Dead Sea concession for mineral extraction was given to a Russian Jewish immigrant and mining engineer called Moshe Novomesky. His company, Palestine Potash Limited, or PPL, grew into one of the most important industrial endeavors in mandatory Palestine. This chapter explores how setting up an industry to extract minerals from the Dead Sea significantly altered the landscape of the lake and its immediate surroundings. It also had more encompassing effects, as wider PPL-built infrastructures influenced the construction of the port and industrial zone of the Mediterranean city of Haifa, and negatively impacted local Bedouins' grazing rights and Arab farmers' lands, as they were expropriated as needed by PPL. This focus on an industrial enterprise provides an underrepresented addition to the usual emphasis on agricultural development in mandatory Palestine and in Zionist history more generally. The chapter also weakens established borders of the region by reading the Palestinian infrastructural networks in a broader Middle Eastern framework, stretching from Jerusalem and Haifa to Damascus, Beirut, and Amman, and by seriously considering the political implications of an industry built on the border zone between two British mandates, the Palestinian and the Transjordanian one. The final chapter on the Botanical Garden in Jerusalem emphasizes colonial networks running through the British Empire by focusing on a small scientific community of Jewish botanists at the Hebrew University. This community traveled widely for research purposes, establishing an extensive network spanning 6 continents. In Palestine, they created the self-proclaimed first botanical garden in the Middle East. The twofold goal of this project was to educate future generations in scientific botany and to recreate a small part of the Holy Land in the image of biblical times. I explore the transnationality of the environment by tracing networks and exchanges of people and their knowledge, as well as networks and exchanges of plants and seeds. And this chapter also allows me to reflect on the bigger question of showcasing and altering the environment for imperial and colonial purposes. And I just want to briefly point out on the slide where the Botanical Garden is. So this is a picture of Hebrew University in 1937, and the garden is this part over here. By combining different examples of landscape change in one study, my research shows the benefits of reading these different types of changes related to animals, trees, and plants, but also mineral resources, industry, infrastructure, and scientific knowledge creation together. I conceptualize my case studies as building onto each other. We are moving from the soil to vegetation and plants to an industry, and finally we end up with scientific community. While the chapters don't necessarily connect directly in the sense that we don't always encounter the same actors or the same landscapes, I see them as building or reflecting a sequence of colonial acts to shape the environment according to the British and Zionist goals. The research shows that landscape changes have an impact on local power relations, as they can empower, marginalize, disenfranchise, or expel communities. Moreover, those changes help Zionist and British mandate actors make knowledge claims, take over land, and modernize and develop according to European colonial standards. Lastly, the different strategies and policies of changing the landscape can be connected by shared ideologies, by actors, and by material changes that were introduced. Ideologies connecting the chapters are, for example, environmental orientalism, which I'll explore more today, an obsession with productivity and fertility of the land, and a connected fear of degradation and desertification. Actors that are connecting the chapters are so-called experts on the environment, often colonial officials and colonial scientists such as foresters and botanists, but also the scientific communities and the trans-imperial connections that they established. And the material changes that are connecting the chapters are related to planting activities such as large-scale afforestation or the creation of the botanical garden, the demarcation of land and land expropriation, new infrastructures such as roads and port facilities, but also new institutions such as the Department of Botany at the Hebrew University and the Soil Conservation Board. So with this, I want to conclude the first part of the presentation about the overview of my dissertation, and we'll move on to the primary source that I brought for today. So this is a source that lies at the heart of my first chapter on land reclamation techniques. Don't bother reading the text, I'll read it out with you in a minute. So what we see here is a calendar sheet of the Soil Conservation Board, which was a British organization established in 1940 in Palestine. We can see here part of a calendar. This is for 1943 and for the months July, August, and September. And on the picture, you can see a landscape of Palestine in the very background. Over here, you will see a little bit of the Mediterranean. And then we have a coastal strip with a dune and a settlement, as well as an orchard, probably a fruit orchard. What we can see on the picture is there's a flock of goats grazing on the sand dunes, and thereby basically moving the sand onto the settlement and the orchard and threatening agriculture and life over there. The text of the source says, "This scene is common along the coast, where goats have destroyed vegetation on the sand and allowed dunes to be moved by the wind onto the villages and agricultural land. Palestine could be a garden. It is losing its soil and becoming a desert. The Soil Conservation Board encourages all efforts to save the soil and protect the vegetation." So the drawings of this calendar, and I have a couple more throughout the presentation, They depict the stark contrast between the so-called wild desert landscape and the highly orderly and engineered landscapes the British saw as desirable. Terraced hills, straight rows of fruit trees forming mostly citrus orchards, and clearly demarcate agricultural fields. As a contrast, flocks of goats symbolize the advance of the desert and the degradation of the land's fertility due to overgrazing. In this source, the goat is singled out as an environmentally destructive agent that is overgrazing, thereby removing vegetation and contributing to the desertification of the land. This aspect of the goat being a destroyer of the environment was part of a wider narrative on environmental decline. According to this narrative, the environment of Palestine that the British encountered from the 1910s onwards was a degraded version of a former and more fertile past. British understanding of the Palestinian environment was highly influenced by so-called Declensionist thought. Declensionist narratives understand the environments in question as having consistently deteriorated and being in danger of further deterioration. Simplified, the main claim in this narrative is that the environments in question have turned from forests into deserts. In the Palestinian case, this supposed decline of the environment was mostly related to an assumed ongoing deforestation, soil erosion, and the always feared advance of the desert that would make Palestine even less fertile than the British assumed it to be already. I want to show you today that this thought was really entrenched in the British administration in Palestine and what the consequences of this thought were. So the main actors supporting and spreading this narrative were the Department of Forestry and its Soil Conservation Board, who also produced this source, both under the leadership of Gilbert N. Sale, the first conservator of forest and main forestry manager in Palestine from 1936 to 1946. You can see the prevalence of the Declensionist narrative, for example, in consecutive reports by the Forestry Department. In the report that covers the years 1936 to 1939, they say, for example, that the state of the hills is unsatisfactory, as most of the surface is eroded, and probably less than 1% is agricultural land in good condition. The hills were undoubtedly once covered with soil and forest. They should be highly productive, and at present are an artificial desert due to overgrazing. Grazing is singled out as the one factor that mostly contributed to the degradation of the land and its loss of productivity. In the report that followed this one, from 1939 to 1945, grazing is still seen as a formidable problem that, quote, faces forest authorities in many parts of the empire, but is especially acute in Palestine. The department staff saw grazing, particularly by goats, as the main cause for destruction, claiming that, quote, all other forms of damage fade into insignificance beside the destruction caused by grazing. Geographer and environmental historian Diana Davis has shown in her work that similar narratives had been developed during the French occupation of Algeria, starting in the 1830s, thus about 100 years before we are encountering the same or similar narrative in Palestine. In her book, Resurrecting the Granary of Rome, Environmental History and French Colonial Expansion in North Africa, Davis sets out to explain what she calls the French colonial declensionist environmental narrative. This is a bit of a mouthful, but I will explain what this means further on. So according to Davis, this narrative basically was a tale of environmental decline. Hold on, you can read with me. A tale of environmental decline since what was presumed to have been the fertile and forested Roman period. This colonial narrative primarily blamed the pastoralists, especially nomadic pastoralists and their ancestors, the invading Arabs of the 11th century, for deforesting and desertifying North Africa. Negative attitudes of nomadic pastoralism were an integral part of this narrative. These were influenced by anti-fire attitudes of the colonizers, the idea of the so-called stages of civilization, according to which sedentary ways of life are superior to nomadic ones, long-standing antagonism between mobile and settled peoples, ethical judgment that nomads were immoral because they preferred to live outside of civilization, in quotes, and the fact that nomadic production systems were seen as irrational and inefficient because they were supposedly not based on private property. Importantly, Declensionist narratives built on Western-centric misconceptions of foreign environments and a failure to understand arid landscapes as simply different from Northern European ones, rather than degraded, lacking, or inferior. For example, declensionist narratives reveal a limited perception of what constitutes a forest. As stated in Oliver Rackham and Alfred Groh's work on the Mediterranean, quote, "A landscape which an Arab describes as wooded may not seem wooded to a Finn." The same Western bias when encountering foreign landscapes has been discussed in other contexts, for example by Fairhead and Leach, two anthropologists, in their important book, Misreading the African Landscape, published in 1996. In this study, they were looking at sub-Saharan Africa and the tendency of foreigners, especially Western foreigners from a temperate climate, to come in and think wherever there was a group of trees, there must have been a forest before, not the other way around. That locals actually planted trees where a savanna had been before. So basically, reading forest history backwards is what they say. And at the Landhaus, we just, I think last week, we watched the movie that was made based on their research in Guinea, which is called Second Nature. It's freely available on YouTube, and I would just recommend this to everyone because of the images that you can see. So the declensionist narrative also had an important colonial dimension. According to Davis, again, the evolution of the declensionist narrative alongside French colonial practices shows that this narrative of decline and degradation was used opportunistically by the French in their environmental policies for Algeria. The narrative ultimately served three main goals: the appropriation of land and resources, social control, including the provision of labor, and the transformation of subsistence production into commodity production. It is thus crucial to understand the colonial origins of this narrative, as well as how it enabled colonial powers to enforce policies that shaped the environment and people's ways of life. By using declensionist narratives, the environment could be used to legitimize the colonialists' practices and further the settler colonists' goal of shaping the land according to their own imagination and practical needs. Of course, and I would like to emphasize this here, my goal is not to judge the people of the past by the knowledge that we have today, which also can be flawed, of course, and rather trying to uncover the underlying misconceptions and biases of environmental narratives and how these could be instrumentalized. So, switching back to the Palestinian context, we have already seen that in Palestine, the British used a declensionist narrative mostly focused on goat grazing. In accordance with declensionist thought, the British administrators singled out goat herding, a practice with hundreds of years of history, as the one agricultural practice that had brought disaster in its wake by erasing vegetation and thereby making way for soil erosion, dune formation, and other forms of land degradation. This allowed the British to target goat grazing as a destructive practice and introduce legislation that aimed at curtailing the free roaming and grazing of goats in specific areas. Very important work on the Palestinian goat has been done already by Tamar Novik, who has written about the goat and other animals in her forthcoming book, Milk and Honey, Technologies of Plenty in the Making of a Holy Land, which will be published just in July of this year with MIT Press. I would recommend this book to anyone not just interested in goats, but also in generally environmental history of the Middle East, the intersection of technology and religion, and the study of animals, their bodies, and their labor. So in my context, the targeting of goats and their grazing patterns also had a bigger aim. As I argue in my chapter, the British targeting of the goats was an opportune way of targeting a connected practice which they saw as unproductive and harmful to the environment, namely nomadic and semi-nomadic pastoralism. At the time in Palestine, there lived about 65,000 to 100,000 Arabs in the desert region of the Negev and about 17,500 Arabs in the north, the Galilee, that practiced nomadic ways of life. These populations also were the ones that depended on goats and their milk for their subsistence. Like the French in Algeria, the British administrators in Palestine appear consistently prejudiced against nomadic land use practices. These were seen as backwards, inefficient, irrational, unproductive, and generally opposed to modernization and the progress that the colonial powers were supposed to bring to the places under their rule. In the colonial imaginary of a hierarchy of civilizations, nomadic ways of life ranked lower than settled forms of agriculture. Contrary to the assumptions inherent in declensionist narratives, however, most prejudices against nomadic ways of life and goat grazing are unfounded. Scientists have shown that goats' grazing habits are well adjusted to the Mediterranean vegetation, and that the browsing of goats is an efficient measure against wildfires. Moreover, goats provide the poorer sections of the populations with dairy and act as leaders of flocks for nomadic people. Scholarship has also shown that most prejudices against nomadic ways of life are unfounded. My aim here is not to romanticize nomadic pastoralism. However, if done responsibly, nomadic pastoralism is efficient and sustainable in certain environments, including much of the Mediterranean region. In the Eastern Mediterranean context, pastoral nomadism was also an important way of limiting the exposure to malaria, a coping strategy for diversifying amidst a volatile climate, and a means to make use of resources which would otherwise be neglected. Moreover, in the absence of highly scientific ways of land use and modern ways of irrigation, nomadic people had made sustainable use of arid lands for centuries, including in Palestine. According to Davis, quote, traditional methods of raising livestock, including pastoral nomadism, are now understood to be some of the most appropriate and sustainable uses to which these arid and unpredictable environments can be put. Indigenous herders generally understand and work with the intricacies of the local ecology as they time the movement of the animals for the benefit of both animals and plants. The British in Palestine, however, are unable to see the benefits that goat grazing and nomadic lifestyles could have for the environment. This is the view from the Soil Conservation Board. They thus targeted the goat by trying to limit its numbers or settle it in place. In extension, by targeting the free grazing goats, the British also targeted their owner, the nomadic Arab pastoralists, and their ways of life. To this end, the British introduced several pieces of legislation that were aimed at reducing the mobility of the goat and its owner, and that were supposed to regulate and restrict grazing, especially in forested areas. Such settlement practices are in line with French practices in Algeria and colonial practices in other areas that targeted nomadic populations in order to be able to better count, tax, and ultimately control them. Because if you have a moving population, all of this is much more difficult to do. In my chapter, I take this line of reasoning one step further, arguing that the British used their belief in the declensionist narrative and their negative image of the goat and its owner to navigate a volatile political environment. By conflating the goat with its owner in the British communication, British officials could avoid to put the blame directly onto one part of the population, namely the nomadic Arabs. By never mentioning humans as the ones responsible for environmental degradation, they could hide behind the goat as the main actor responsible for the alleged decline of the land. This becomes most obvious when the British make a distinction between the settled and the nomadic goat, standing in for settled and nomadic ways of life in Palestine. For example, in a speech to the Palestine Economic Society in 1942, Sale, the head forester that we've met before, claimed that whereas the wandering goat is an agent of destruction, the tethered goat fed by hand is a valuable citizen. While the miserable black wanderer yields 1 cup of milk, the dainty white animal produces 4 cupfuls of the same size. It is in statements like this that the thinly veiled racial undertones of the British colonial discourse towards the nomads become overt. Neither the nomadic goat nor its owner was considered a valuable citizen. In sum, the stereotypical and orientalist language British officials used to describe the ostensible environmental damages of goat grazing was a way to cover negative attitudes towards the nomadic population with a rational argument of saving the land from overexploitation. By depoliticizing their language and using the goat as a stand-in for its owner, British administrators tried to avoid increased resistance from the Arab population of Palestine towards their rule and policies. British declensionist thought did not have that many immediate implications for the nomads of Palestine during the British Mandate period itself. The British administrators themselves recognized, for example, that their forestry policies were largely defensive, aimed at taking care of the status quo rather than undertaking ambitious conservation and afforestation efforts. Moreover, by 1936, when the Forestry Department was established as an independent body and most uncertainties about land tenure had been resolved, the political situation in Palestine made grand environmental schemes impractical and, well, almost impossible. The British forestry policies in Palestine were thus more remarkable for their ambition than their actual achievements. However, the British declensionist narrative was still influential. In 1950, only 2 years after the British had left Palestine and the State of Israel was created, the Israeli government passed the so-called Black Goat Law, which aimed at eradicating the goat entirely from Palestine. This law was only revoked a few years ago in 2018, when Israel started to understand the ecological benefits goat grazing can have, especially for fire prevention. Besides negative views of the goat, another lasting legacy of British environmental orientalism is the persistence of anti-nomadic attitudes. Israel's long-standing attempts at sedentarizing the nomads of the Negev in so-called recognized villages shows a lack of understanding and an unwillingness to deal with ways of life that are foreign to the ruling elite and potentially disruptive of its state-building project. This, of course, has real effects on people's lives. The Bedouin of the Negev have long faced racial and political discrimination, and the about 100,000 nomads remaining in Israel are among the poorest communities living in the country today. With this brief outlook on the legacies, I want to conclude for today, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.